Hey everyone, welcome to On Tap. I'm Chris, your host, and today, in keeping with our Celtic theme from last episode, we will be talking about some notable beers from Ireland, and this will be the first episode where we discuss the beers of the Emerald Isle. Also, just so we're clear on the rules, the beers in this episode have to be actually from Ireland, as in brewed in the nation, either Republic or Northern Ireland. So, for example, Irish-style beer, like Killing's Irish Red, it's not actually an Irish beer, it's from Chicago. So yeah, won't be talking about that. To the episode. Starting with the oldest brewing operation in all of Ireland, we have Smithwicks. Smithwicks, and yes, it's pronounced Smithwicks, not Smithwicks, was founded in 1710 by the aptly named John Smith in Kilkenny, Ireland, County of Kilkenny, historic province of Leinster. Now, like I talked about with the Belhaven episode, with Belhaven being sort of the oldest still running brewery in all of Scotland, the same is true for Smithwicks in Ireland. Kind of, and we'll talk about that in a minute, with its 1710 founding. Now, allegedly, Mr. Smithwick founded the brewery on a site that had actually been an old abbey where monks, of all people, had been brewing beer since all the way back into the 1300s, Middle Ages, which sounds like an awfully Belgian origin story. Anyway, Mr. Smithwick founded the brewery and started producing beer, at a reasonable volume, but it was really with his great-grandson, Edmund, where production really increased and the brewery kind of found its feet. Production continued on through the 1800s, doing quite well, but then by the late 1800s, Smithwick started running into some financial difficulty, and then by about 1900, the company was close to bankruptcy. But the family owner at the time, James, was able to save the brewery by reducing the number of beers that the company produced, and then just really focusing in on what is now known today as the signature Irish Red Ale. A couple of export deals and military contracts later, and Smithwicks was riding high. So high, in fact, that by 1965, the company was acquired by the Guinness Corporation and has been a subsidiary ever since. Through the late 20th century, Smithwicks was exported not just to Britain, but to countries like France, the United States, and especially Canada, where I understand Smithwick's Draught became one of the most popular imported ales into Canada. Then in 2013, the original Kilkenny brewery was finally shut down by Guinness and operations moved to Dublin to be sort of closer to the Guinness central production hub. And that's what I mean about Smithwicks being technically the oldest brewery in Ireland, if we count oldest as being the same company, regardless of where those operations are set up. However, if you think about it as the oldest brewery having to be the oldest physical brewery at the same site, then yes, as of 2013, Smithwicks has lost that title. Even though allegedly, Smithwicks is still the most popular ale in all of Ireland. Now that is ale, let's just be clear, not stout. Next up, we have Murphy's Irish Stout. The Murphy's Brewery was founded in 1856 by James J. Murphy in the city of Cork, in the County Cork, in the historic province of Munster. And the beer produced by the brewery was, and still is, what's called a dry stout or an Irish stout. And this is going to be a beer that has really no underlying sweetness to it, in contrast to something like a milk stout. Now, as you can imagine, brewing a stout in Ireland in the 1800s, that meant Murphy's was automatically a competitor to Guinness. And the company tried to differentiate itself from its much larger rival by focusing on making a stout that was, as they described it, a little lighter and smoother in feel compared to Guinness. It wasn't easy competing against such a much larger company, but nonetheless, by the 1860s, Murphy's was able to have a bit of a decent market share in Ireland and was one of the island's larger breweries. And also, fun fact, apparently in 1915, the company purchased the first gasoline-powered truck in all of Ireland. Don't know how we verify that. Also, what with World War I and demand for motorized vehicles, but anyway. Now, for about 125 years since the founding, Murphy's remained pretty much a small, family-run brewery that was just slowly building up a name for itself as a producer of quality stout. There was, of course, some export to the UK and eventually a little bit to the US by the 70s, but it was really with the Heineken Corporation's acquisition of Murphy's in 1983 that this company was able to actually export its beer around the world in larger quantities, and people could start to actually find Murphy's Stout outside of just the UK and Ireland. So these days you can find Murphy's in 40 countries worldwide, and production, while certainly not at the level of Guinness, is still reasonably okay. About 75,000 barrels UK, it's a bit more than about 100,000 barrels US, which is decent business, though those numbers are down a little bit from 2000 when the beer enjoyed a little bit more popularity than it does today. The company has its greatest market share in Ireland, unsurprisingly, followed by Britain. Murphy's is also still one of the most consumed beers in the greater Cork area, making up around 1/3 of all of the beer consumed there. So it does does still have somewhat of a hometown advantage. Now, characteristic of many Irish stouts, and actually many beers that one might consume on tap in the UK and Ireland, Murphy's is reasonably low in alcohol at around 4% ABV. But again, that's unsurprising, and it's very similar to many other styles of beer from the British Isles, such as bitters, which one would find more commonly in Britain, especially England. And I know that I've been able to find Murphy's certainly in craft beer bars and in certain sort of more authentic Irish pubs around the US, and that's Murphy's on tap, mind you. Next, we have Harp. Now, it's important to note that Harp is a lager. Why is this important? Well, as I've kind of referred to in earlier videos, lager's not historically or sort of traditionally been a style of beer one would associate with the British Isles, and this is the case for Harp. The beer is indeed Irish, but the label was only founded in 1960. And actually from the start, Harp was a beer produced by the Guinness Corporation as a way for the brewery to field its own variety of continental style lager in the face of growing popularity of lagers in the UK and Ireland after World War II. So, in the face of the Brits and the Irish drinking ever more continental beer, Guinness decided to get their own German brewer, Dr. Hermann Munster, to help produce a kind of beer that you'd find more in something like a Munich beer hall, rather than an Irish pub. And the result was Harp, named after the symbol of Ireland, the harp. Like, let me put it this way. If Ireland was a Game of Thrones house, their sigil would definitely be a harp, not a shamrock. And that's a hot take from Chris. Anyway, so Guinness basically retooled one of its breweries in Dundalk in County Louth from producing Irish stout to lager. And actually a few years after the brewery got going, Harp's popularity exploded in actually the province of Ulster of all places. And if we know our Irish geopolitics, we'll know that the vast majority of Ulster, both in terms of population and land area, actually comprises Northern Ireland, which is a part of the United Kingdom. But then in 2008, Guinness closed the Dundalk brewery and reorganized Harp production to be around the central Guinness hub in Dublin. Though there is also a Harp brewery in the UK, specifically it's in Salford, which is sort of a municipality of Manchester. And that actually produces most of the Harp that's exported around the world outside of really just Britain and Ireland. Now, for those of us who live under a rock, everything in this episode thus far might be just fine and dandy. But I'm gonna hazard a guess that some of you out there, probably most all of you out there, are wondering, where the hell is the Guinness, Chris? Only the most recognizable Irish beer of all time. And you know, I figured this episode's long enough, we'll just skip it. Am I kidding? Well, yes, but actually no. Let's just say I haven't forgotten, don't worry. See, here's the thing. Guinness is the only beer that I exclusively drink on tap when I'm out and about. I don't drink it at all from the can or the bottle. And so what I want to do is have an episode where we are actually drinking Guinness in a real bar or pub. And that is an episode I hope to do in the not too distant future. So, what kind of flagship beers do these three companies make? First, we've got the Harp Lager. This is a characteristic pale lager brewed in the style of something you might find in Germany. I'd imagine this is going to be pretty non-controversial, standard, basic beer. Smithwicks Irish Red Ale. This is the characteristic Smithwicks, which is going to have, well, a reddish amber color to it. And the reddish amber color actually comes from there being a very small amount of roasted barley used in the brewing process, combined with a much larger amount of malted barley. And it's really that little bit of roasted barley that gives the beer that darker sort of reddish hue. And this style of beer is, unsurprisingly, known as an Irish Red. Murphy's Irish Stout. This is going to have the taste of, someone described it as beer-flavored chocolate milk, or the beer version of chocolate milk. So it's going to be very creamy, silky, and smooth. There's also going to be, though, some notes of toffee and coffee in the beer, but because the company said that there's not really any bitterness to it, and there's coffee in it, I don't know what that's going to taste like, so we shall see. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for tasting. So first up, we have Harp Lager. So again, this is a brand of beer brewed by the Guinness Corporation, brewed by the Guinness Corporation, starting in 1960. And it's their version of a continental style lager. Looks like a lager beer to me. Smells like a lager beer. And it tastes like a lager beer. That's perfectly fine. Nice, refreshing. I wouldn't say exceptionally crisp. There's not really an edge to this, but it does have a couple sort of bright notes to it. It does feel fairly clean. And of course, it's got an acceptable body, so it's not like a light beer or anything. You know, like so many of these other lager beers, this is a perfectly fine, acceptable, easy to drink, not controversial table beer. Continuing on, let's try Smithwick's Red Ale. I don't know about ruby red. I'd say this is more, it's an amber color. You know, it's sort of an amberish red. Yeah, smells a little malty. Yeah, it's all fairly mild. There aren't a lot of really strong flavors in this, but I don't necessarily think that's terrible. It's almost like kind of calming, where there's a little bit of malt to it, a little bit of just a tiny hint of like a little bit of caramel sweetness, but I wouldn't say this is like a sweet beer at all. It's more just, it's kind of nice. It's got a medium body. The one thing I would say though is it's not that full bodied. Like, it does feel a tad thin, but it's very easily drinkable, but there's nothing really sort of sharp or anything that kind of stands out. So last but not least, time for the Murphy Stout. Now, I don't know if you can hear, and I'm going to talk about this. I realize I don't actually have time to talk about it in this episode, but I don't know if you can hear, but there's a little clanging sound. Picking that up? Yeah, there we go. There's a little clanging sound coming from the inside of this beer. That is because of something called a widget, which is inside of this can. And what that's going to do is it's going to help pour a bit nicer of a head on the beer when we give it a pour. And I realized what I'll do is I'll talk about widgets in another episode and get into sort of what that is. But anyway, that's inside of this can, and hopefully it should help with the head. So let's crack this open. We've got to wait for the sort of the beer to settle. We can see it right there, sort of the carbonation as it's kind of making its way. There's sort of the creamy head that's forming on top, and then the rest of the beer that's going to be dark. And so we'll just give it another minute, give it a little bit of time. And of course, for all of us who have had pints of sort of Irish stout poured in pubs, of course we know sometimes you gotta wait a little bit, gotta wait for good things. Yep, okay, that smells very dry. That's nice, that's very nice. It's very dry. So it definitely lives up to the name of being a dry Irish stout. I mean, honestly, after drinking that, my palate just feels a little bit, less hydrated, but not in a bad way. You know, sometimes IPAs will do that, where they really kind of dry out your mouth, and this has a little bit of that dryness to it, but I quite enjoy it. It's a very nice sort of feeling, and the beer is definitely, it's silky, it's smooth. Again, just because of that dryness, I don't know about creamy, but it does have a very nice consistency to it, nice feeling. And also the fact is that, as I said, this is sort of, it says here 4% ABV. At a lower ABV, it's easy to kind of to sip on, and a way to sort of, spend an evening where you can just be, chatting to people and still being kind of sensible. As I said, I'm not getting any sweetness from this. I'm not getting any sense of toffee or really any sense of chocolate. I mean, if we were talking about absolute, just like midnight, 95% dark chocolate, sure, absolutely. This would be about as dark chocolate as you could possibly imagine, where there's no sweetness to it. It's just kind of a bit of bitterness. There's also not a particularly strong coffee flavor to it, though I think there's maybe just a hint. What the major notes on this are, it's a silky dryness. That's what I would describe this as. It's a silky dryness, and then when it's sitting on your palate, there's a really hint, very, very slight hint of coffee, or maybe super dark chocolate, but there's not really a sense of chocolate milk. Though I do see where they're coming from on that, because it does have a very, very nice, sort of silky texture to it. So the dryness, the silkiness, all woven together makes for a very enjoyable drinking experience with Murphy Stout. And even in the can, which, you know, I'm not usually a huge fan of, but I gotta say, the widget probably, I gotta hats off to the widget, making this work properly, getting a nice head on that, getting it to be a, you know, nice pour, works very well. So, let's go through the final tally. In third place, we have the Harp Lager. While this is not objectively a bad beer, it is a very standard, generic lager beer. I've used the term before, something tastes like beer, this tastes like beer. No more, no less. You pretty much know exactly what you're gonna get with something like this. Very easy to drink and, you know, not particularly exemplary in any real sense. In second place, we have Smithwick's Red Ale. This is, I would say almost in some ways, it's like Harp that's a little bit more interesting. Now, not by, I think, a tremendous margin, but it is a little bit more interesting just with the flavor profile. Though I will say, I do actually think Harp has a slightly better body to it than Smithwick's. The weakest aspect of this, I think, is the body. It feels a tad on the thin side. Again, not a deal breaker, but a tad on the thin side. But in terms of the flavor profile, there's, you know, some maltiness, a little bit of sort of, you know, biscuity maltiness, and just a tiny, tiny hint of sort of a caramel sweetness to it. So like the Harp, it's sort of a very easily drinkable sort of table beer, nothing particularly strong standing out in terms of the flavors. This is also a beer that I think you could have in a wide variety of situations, only exception maybe being really hot weather. And then finally, in first place, I gotta give it to Murphy's Stout. Just of the three, this is, I think, the most enjoyable drinking experience. It's just this very nice, sort of non-sweet, dry Irish stout. I've kind of described it, if you think about sort of that silky, smooth, consistency, to be fair, you know, as people have said, like chocolate milk, but you have the flavor profile of like 95%, extremely bitter, you know, no sugar, little bit of hint of coffee in there, very easy to drink, and just kind of a nice kind of, you know, complement of flavors. So it's not gonna be the boldest stout you're ever gonna have. It's not gonna have, you know, extreme flavors of chocolate that's been, you know, spiced with something, or, you know, heavily roasted coffee that's just, you know, kind of bursting in your mouth. And there are stouts, of course, out there. But here the flavors are just very, very mellow, but in a very sort of enjoyable way. I think that's what I like about this the most. It's, the flavors are mellow and they're reasonably subtle, but they're all very enjoyable. Here the flavors, frankly, a little too subtle to the point where I could say probably could have a little bit more flavor, and then, you know, same thing with here. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. If you want to give this video a like and as well subscribe to the channel, it would really mean a lot. Your views and subscriptions do help us grow the channel, and that allows us to make more content. Hope to see you next time.